Let's think about not only delivering a great project, but how can we deliver a great experience? And the experience itself is in many cases a strategy project in itself. So we create the great thing, and then how do we actually get our clients to buy into it? That's a different conversation. And in some cases, stuff, as we know, ends up on the cutting room floor because we weren't successful in convincing a client to go with it.
Welcome to the Agency Profit Podcast, a show dedicated to going deep space on agency operations, which is just as nerdy as it sounds. I'm your host, Marcel I'm the CEO of Parakeeto, a firm that helps digital and creative agencies measure and improve their profitability. Join me as I interview some of the smartest thought leaders and agency owners in our space and go deep into operations, metrics, and all the other things you need to get right so you can spend less time worrying about operations and more time executing on your vision. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Agency Profit Podcast. Today, I'm joined by an award-winning creative director, former agency owner, a person with over 2 decades of experience working in and on agencies. And today, he helps agency owners communicate more clearly and really wow their clients and improve the client experience through better communication. And today, we're going to dig into how to architect incredible client experiences that lead to ongoing and lasting client relationships and really, allow you to tap into recurring work or add-on projects after an initial engagement. So with all of that, Joey Tackett, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm super excited. I love your podcast and I'm excited to dig into these things and hopefully people can walk away with something really, really useful today.
I'm sure that they will, because you've got a wealth of experience really being in their shoes, both running your own firms, but then also, working at the director level in other firms. So before we get into the topic du jour, I'd love to have you, in your own words, describe what you do and who you serve.
Yeah, actually, and to clarify, I went back out on my own last year. So I'm an agency owner as well. So I am the audience we're speaking to, which was an exciting move. And I did that really to do some of the things that you just spoke about, helping agency owners speak with confidence, speak with persuasion, and really understand how to make all of their words count with their clients. And that involves a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about today. So I'm doing that now in my current agency. So it's a mixture of working with clients in a consulting aspect, like what you and I do, where we're doing done-for-you projects and getting in there and really helping them with the things we're going to talk about today. And I'm also doing coaching. I have various courses and things like that your listeners may be interested in as well. So I'm really tackling it from both angles, coaching the agency owner, mindset, helping them understand how to show up really great, and also how to manage their teams. That's really important, how to really inspire their teams to speak with clarity and persuasion as well.
And so what was it about this problem that made you want to go off and do this as your full-time thing?
Yeah, well, it's something that I have been a student of my entire career as well. So my background, just so people understand, I came up through the ranks into the agency world and ended up being at creative director level. So I'm a designer. I'm a visual designer. I'm a brand designer and also produce videos as well. So, I know people come into the agency in different capacities. And I came up through the ranks of the doer and then became the leader. And I think that's important to note because there's this understanding for any of you listening that have done that. You understand deeply what your team really needs. And I think that is an important piece. And what I saw was a gap. I saw a gap when we talk a lot about what you talk about a lot on this podcast, process, systems, things like that. I was noticing that often there was a gap between that and these soft skills, helping people show up and know what to say, understanding how to listen to the client better. These things that sometimes we're getting lost when we're trying to scale, and create more projects and turn things into repeatable systems. And I think both can work together. So I set out to really figure that out and understand how to make both exist. Because my thinking is you want to create a system that actually achieves that, right? We want to build trust with clients. And so how can we systematize that? And so sort of, engineering it from the different direction, really, and to understand how to do it that way. So that was the passion. I love presenting to clients. I love painting a picture, wooing them, helping them understand who they can be when this website launches or when this thing goes out to the public. And I think that seeing those people light up in those settings and seeing my team do that as well and presenting that way is so great. Like when you can just really wow a client and not just deliver what you said, but actually take them to a new place where they're clapping and smiling. That's perfect. So it's really the addiction to that that made me want to get into it. And I want to see other agency owners have those same experiences.
It's quite a thrilling experience, especially for those that have been in an agency context where like pitching and presenting concepts is, a big part of what they do. There's certainly a certain kind of person that is really drawn to that, and you can
Yeah.
get a lot out of, what is a very intense and often an emotional roller coaster kind of experience. But when you really nail it, it feels so good.
Yeah.
And so with all of that, there are lots of people listening that, we were discussing before the show. I think a large portion of our audience often have a foot in the door or kind of an upfront project that they typically do with clients before they then roll into either ongoing work and additional projects or, into some kind of a recurring model, whether that be a retainer or ongoing marketing services or what have you. And many of them listening, I'm sure, would love to improve the length of the relationship that they have with clients. So let's start with some of the symptoms or challenges that they might be facing that would indicate to them that they have an opportunity to dig into their client experience and look to improve it in this way.
Yeah, that's a great question, because I find a lot of agency owners do miss some of those initial symptoms or pieces as you described. And I do want to create a caveat by saying, if you're listening today and you're thinking, okay, it's just a website project, it's never just a website project. And I would say that to people that are listening today that I've managed in the past and people I manage now, it's never just what the client hired us for. And I firmly believe that. And I think when you go in with that mindset, you're able to start to think of yourself as a consultant at large, because we're humans interacting with other humans, right? And we're spending a lot of intimate time in these projects, even a website. If you think about the technicalities, as we both know, there are a lot of emotional decisions in a website design. There are, because branding is involved, messaging is involved. Who do we want to be when we grow up? How do we niche down? There's all these questions that can really throw an agency owner off if they're not sure, or they're not sure who they want to be, or they don't want to pick a direction. That can really be crippling. And so I don't know if you've experienced this in your work, but I see it a lot where there's a bit of a therapy session going on in the beginning when you're doing these initial discovery sessions and things like that. So I think that's the perfect place to start. And I'm presuming a lot of your clients, the agency owners listening today and agency leaders are doing this, but you do some sort of onboarding process, a discovery process where you're understanding what should be in this project, whether it is a branding project or a website project. That, I think, is how you can reconfigure that specific meeting to not be so tactical and actually be rather visionary. And I could give some tangible examples if you'd like me to do that right now of some ways that I've done that in the past with regard to thinking about going into that initial meeting and not asking questions out the gate, which are, those of us that do website design know technical requirements, right? What does the thing need to do? How's it going to work? That is very important. Though what I've seen success in, both at agencies I've managed, and currently I'm doing this now, and also agencies where I've been a senior leader, a C-suite leader, we have gone in and said, we're breaking this down. And in many cases, we would push the technical requirement conversation to after the initial human conversation. So we're doing this large kickoff meeting with our team and their team. And we're asking questions like, what does success look like? What happens when this is successful? Paint a picture for us on what this website fixes, right? Talk to us about why someone needs to click on this button, and really trying to push them hard to get into some emotive language. That is money, because when you do that, you start to hear their real pain points. And if they start to trust you, which they will, because you're asking them questions that they care about, then they're going to start giving you gold. And obviously, if you're recording this meeting, you can go back and find words that come back directly later in pitches. They come back later in product delivery pitches, right? So now you can say you wanted to create more inspiration in your website user. Here's how we create more inspiration, right? That's great. And I think a lot of times we miss that because we're either not prepared for that initial discovery meeting, we're running in frazzled, it's done in a more rote way. And I think that's a missed opportunity. So that it's really a headspace shift. And it's also getting your team on board, because I will say, those of you that are listening today that do manage larger teams, and if you're going in with multiple team members, which I would recommend actually in a kickoff, those team members can all play different roles, because the client is going to gravitate to one of those people more than the other. I've seen situations, Marcel, where junior designers become the trust relationship with the client. And I've seen situations where I've managed mid-level designers that actually upsell a massive project because they don't want to hear from me. They think I'm invested in the company, right? The senior designer is just telling them what they need to do. And in many cases, I've seen magic happen where the upsells and the conversions and the retention is actually built and managed by mid-level staff. Think about that for a second. That's pretty powerful.
It's so funny that you mentioned that. I have a good friend that sells security systems, and he told me this great story about how he was working with a credit union, and the credit union needed to do this upgrade, and they were, that upgrade opened the door to like upgrading a whole bunch of other equipment and basically taking a project that should have been a couple $100,000 and turning it into $1 million project. Yeah. And he smartly recognized that they had a long and trusted relationship with the maintenance guy that showed up every couple of months to fix things up. And when that came from him, that recommendation, it overcame all the objections that were coming up and the deal went through. And so to your point, it's really about identifying where that trust lies, and it could be with an unexpected person.
Absolutely. And I would say it's more common than not. And I have always manufactured scenarios in agencies when I'm working with larger teams where that's possible. So I'm a huge fan of bringing in the team to client meetings when appropriate, because it does two things. It gives your team a chance to grow, because it's so hard to understand how to build confidence when you're not in the room. And also it removes the telephone game where it's all going through me and I'm having to now translate it through me and an account manager, for example, back to the people that need to help execute on it. So I think it's a win-win in both counts. And also then you can do what I call staging. So it comes from my passion in film and theater and all that. I live in Hollywood, right? I mean, I'm around the arts all the time. And I think there's something scientific and artistic about staging a meeting. So what I mean by that is going into, let's say it's the initial delivery when you're showing a lot of really cool concepts. It's your first big reveal of your ideas, right? That big, important pinnacle meeting. Bring the people in, and I've often had my teams stage such that you are talking about the color. I'm talking about the client, their client engagement. Another person's talking about the technical requirements. So it's like a good production. You have these characters that you're developing, and what happens is people start to be positioned as experts. And I think that's really powerful, because then you can start to help the client see those people in that light, and you can actually rebrand a client experience by doing that. But it takes strategy. So my message to your listeners, and myself included, and you, would be, let's think about not only delivering a great project, but how can we deliver a great experience? And the experience itself is in many cases a strategy project in itself. So we create the great thing, and then how do we actually get our clients to buy into it? That's a different conversation. And in some cases, stuff, as we know, ends up on the cutting room floor because we weren't successful in convincing a client to go with it. So I'm a big advocate of doing both and thinking about both in the development of the project, how we're going to position it and how we're going to then deliver great work. But don't just deliver great work. We got to sell it too.
It's a big idea and an important one, because I think there's a lot of compromises that typically have to get made in a creative engagement, right? Very rarely are you going to be working with an unlimited budget.
Right.
And my sense is that, to kind of take a step back, one of the fundamental things that you talked about was in that initial kickoff with the client and in those early conversations, starting to really change the aperture of that conversation and cropping out from the project, really trying to get the context on what's happening around it. And that, to your point, is going to create all kinds of different opportunities for you to not only tie the work back to deeper things that were meaningful to them, but also understand what it fits into and how you can create through lines to other work. My sense is that a lot of people actually might shy away from that conversation because they're afraid of scope creep. And they see that actually as a risky conversation as opposed to seeing it as an opportunity. And that might come from maybe not being clear on how to properly manage the expectations while kind of holding those two things in one engagement of like really trying to expand the aperture, but still protecting the scope. So maybe let's speak to that a little bit, because I get the sense that some people might be afraid of that conversation because maybe they've gotten burned in the past by not really understanding how to balance those two things.
That is a great question, because no matter what size the team is, right now my agency now is more boutique. So I'm going in with a smaller group of people, though we still are managing that conversation as compared to even a large team when I've gone in with 15 people from my agency side. and there's account managers on the team. So account managers are who you're describing that often has this difficult conversation, right? And they're the ones often that are scared of it too. So if you have account managers, on those listening that have a team of account managers, they hate this also because they start to get afraid of the scope creep as well, especially project managers between the account and project team. Project managers are often the ones that will try to kill innovation. Sorry, everyone. I mean, I love project managers, but often they'll try to kill it because they'll kill the innovation because they're afraid of scope creep even before it goes to the client. So in many cases, if you're working with a larger team, you're going to have to convince the project managers first, to some degree the account managers. And then when you get to the client, then, you can frame it that way. Some tangible ways that I like to do that is, number one, don't just come up with things on the fly in the meetings. So I think usually when you're working with even a small team, even if it's just you and you're an agency of one and you're going in presenting something, in your mind where there's an opportunity to expand scope. And I encourage everyone to write that down, identify it, so there's no a shock when we go in and someone brings it up. We've already thought it through. We've thought about what it might cost, and we're prepared for that conversation. So even in our mind and our team's mind, we're able to delineate what's current scope and what's future scope. And then you can use your words to cue that. And that's key. So for example, you might be able to then say, we love this idea because of this, that, and the other. Now, keep in mind, we can go with what we originally created. We love this new idea. It would be an additional scope, but we think you're going to like it. So you're couching it with all of these really exciting things, but you're letting the client know, yeah, it's going to cost you more money. And I find when we do it that way, they're so excited. Either they'll say yes, or they'll find the money, or at the very worst, they'll say, we want to do it in a future scope when we find the money, right? I've rarely seen a client get mad when you pitch something new, as long as you don't promise that it's part of the original scope. So that's number one. And then number two, making sure your team understands that too. So if you are bringing in those mid-level designers, those mid-level strategists, making sure they understand how to speak about it too, and they're not promising a bunch of things. So they need to understand what's in scope and out of scope as well. Yeah, so making sure everyone's clear on that. But I think it's very unfortunate when people shy away from upselling in that situation because we're afraid to have the conversation, because that keeps us stuck. That's what keeps us small. That's what keeps a relationship from growing. And that's unfortunate.
And it's really interesting. I've talked about this on the show before, but understanding what the contract model is such an important piece of going into that conversation as well. Because let's say, for example, you sold a time and materials engagement. Right. The way you have that scope conversation is very different than if it's a fixed bid, or if you are on kind of like a creative retainer, and like the mechanics of how a scope changes and what the scope is anchored to is different. And so as an account manager, like if you develop that skill, it should give you more confidence going into that conversation, because you know kind of where am I setting my anchors. And if the client says, I want that, or that's something I'm interested in, or I want to present something, it's really clear, okay, here's how we could make that happen, or here's what that would mean. Here's the variable that's locked, but here's the variable that we get to open up and right. renegotiate in this context. So that's a really great tip. Last question on this, in terms of really extracting the opportunities from the client, extracting that broader context. For somebody that's listening that maybe isn't used to having that conversation, any quick tips or strategies for how to go into a client meeting and get some of that high value context out of them?
Yeah. And you're speaking about the pain points, correct? Understanding what they care about in this case. Yeah, exactly. So great question. So I actually have this in a whole guide that I use in some of my courses. I call it the client POV guide, the point of view. And it's really by design, it's called that for a reason, because it's the idea that we need to get into their headspace, not stay in ours. So in all of my coaching programs in this space, I always start off with this whole module called Think Like Your Client. So that's what I'll share with your audience now. How do we think like our client? And it involves visualizing, number one. It involves visualizing the world through their eyes for a few moments before you actually go into the conversation. And we don't often do this when we're very busy. If you think about it, we have a bunch of meetings throughout the day, especially if you're a very busy agency. We don't prepare our teams to be able to do this. We're just going in, talking about what we care about and not talking about what they care about. So there's some questions that I love to ask going in, and this guide goes through a lot of them, but I'll give you the top 4 that if you do this, you'll be really golden on it. and I'm actually going to pull it up here so I can read them to you. Number one, what does their manager, their board, their stakeholders care about? So this would be the case that if you are working with someone that's not the agency owner, who are they reporting to? Even if they have partners, agency owner partners, right? What do they care about? Because we're not just speaking to the decision maker, we're speaking to all the people that they interact with. So we want to know what they care about. What great things will happen when this project is successful? So asking ourselves that question as well. You can ask these first two questions directly to a client, and I've done that very well in a discovery meeting. You can phrase it however you'd like, but I think those two are really powerful to help us understand, what does success look like? And then also, if they're answering that question in a very tactical way, try to push a little harder and say, but how will people feel? What will your audience do? What will your customers want? Just really trying to help them give us language that's rich and textured. 3, this is a question, these last two you don't ask directly, but we infer based on our team projecting what they might be thinking about. So the third one is, what about their work may be keeping them up at night, ruminating or worrying? This is a big one. Both of us being agency owners as well, you understand this feeling. It's not the problem we're going to talk to a vendor about, but if we can imagine what that might be by piecing together things they said, we can work with this assumption that can really help us shape what we think their pain would be. And then the fourth one is, what will happen to their job security or their business if they're the agency owner if this project is not successful? So those are 4 questions that I think are great. The guide goes into a lot more, but I think if you answer those 4, imagine you're going to be in a much better place. I recommend doing what I've done with my teams, and I currently do now, is creating a project primer or a pain primer, if you will, in this case, and writing these down. So we understand what it is going into it. And actually, like you would do in any mindset activity, a lot of us agency owners listening, we understand mindset's very important. Centering ourselves, visualizing is important. This is an activity you can do. And I encourage the team to read the primer before they go into those big meetings, because it's one thing to have it in the back of our mind. It's another thing to have it fresh right at that moment, so we can actually feel what they're feeling. We can imagine, oh my, if this thing fails, this person may actually lose their agency. Like, is it that big? Or is it more, no, everyone's going to be annoyed with them if it fails? Well, that's a very different pain point. And we want to be able to speak to the severity of that pain point, in our language. And so I think those questions are really helpful. And I find for teams too, if you're bringing on teams that are new to the agency space, this is great because no one teaches this in school. I speak on campuses, I talk in classes. They're not teaching this stuff in the agency training programs.
Do you want some free resources to help you measure and improve your profitability? If you do, then I want to tell you about our agency profitability toolkit, which you can grab absolutely free in the show notes or by heading to parakeeto.com/toolkit. It's packed with training videos, cheat sheets, templates, and all kinds of other great resources to help you start measuring and improving the essential metrics that are going to drive better profitability in your business. And it's helped thousands of other agencies around the world do the same. So I want to encourage you to go and grab a copy of that. And if you'd rather get in the fast lane and just have our team of experts guide you through the process of measuring and improving your profitability, then I want to encourage you to apply for a consultation at parakeeto.com. And with that, I want to thank you again for tuning in. I hope you enjoy the episode, and I'll let you get back to it. One of the things that you surfaced there, which I think is so important, and those that have worked with larger companies will know this innately, but as you start to move up market, understanding that often the person you're working with is not the CEO or, necessarily like the final decision maker. And like this person's career is going to be heavily influenced by this purchasing decision and this project that they're engaging with you in. And I remember hearing somebody at a consulting firm talk about how their objective in every engagement is to get the person that hired them promoted. And when they started thinking about engagements in that way, how much it changed things for them. And it kind of comes back to that old adage of like, no one's ever gotten fired for buying Salesforce.
Right.
You wonder like, how is Salesforce still selling software for hundreds of thousands of dollars when, if you've ever looked at it, like it's not great. And that's why, because no one's ever gotten fired for buying Salesforce. So as you get into larger organizations, so many of those questions that you asked around stakeholder management and understanding what is this person's situation, but who are all the other people around them that they have to work through in this engagement?
Yeah.
It's great context. And I also love that spin on taking something that you want them to articulate and flipping it into the negative side, because I'm sure you've had this experience where a client can't articulate what they want, but they can articulate very clearly what they don't want, or they can't really articulate what it looks like when it's good, but they can articulate what it looks like when it's bad. And
Yes.
so sometimes just reversing that question gets you a much better outcome.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. And those last two, it may not be great to ask it outright. You kind of have to ask around it because you don't want to, make people annoyed. But I do think that it is important to understand that. And they may share it with you directly. Some clients will really share with you, I will lose my job if this doesn't work. Great. Write it down, internalize it, put it in your primer, and remember that every time you pitch to them or present to them in the project going forward. There is one angle that I would like to share, if it's okay, regarding where I see a lot of the retention problems happen with a new project. So let's imagine it's a website project, because it sounds like that's an important one. And it's one that I know very well, having worked at exclusively web agencies before. And prior, I worked at a web agency and then turned more full service. And that is a challenge I think a lot of people see, because as we know, a website project is often way later in the marketing strategy process than branding or marketing positioning or whatever. And so in many cases, you're having to clean up the mess of either what they did wrong or what another vendor created that maybe didn't set them up for success, right? Because you're launching this website. But what I find is interesting is whether it is a website or not, when you're getting to the project and you're positioning that and we're presenting ideas to them and we're getting everything in front of the client, we know that it's a multi-month engagement usually, if not longer than that. And I find that a lot of people we're out the gate really good in the beginning. The first presentation is often great, or maybe it isn't great, but that's often where we try to pick ways to fix things, right? So that first big reveal, the concepts, the look, the thing, whatever. Fast forward to 2 months later, when we're actually getting ready to launch this item, or 3 weeks out, and there are bugs and the product requirements aren't being met, and we're having to talk about, quote, trade-offs. What I find is that's often where the client trust is completely uprooted. And what a lot of agencies have done, and I won't name drop anyone because I think this is something that I understand why we fall into it, but I've seen it and I've been in it, where we don't, as agency owners, put enough resources on the tail end of the project. We put them on the front end. And we hope that a project manager, or sometimes even a mid-level designer, is the one that's front-facing with the client when the heat is high. It's the highest. And that's when we need all hands on deck, because when we talk about trust and we talk about the pain point of what will happen if this isn't successful, we're often putting our least amount of energy in those conversations when the client is most afraid of that catastrophic event happening. And I've seen that happen across the board. So I push a lot of energy throughout the project, and certainly at the end of a project. So when a launch is coming, I recommend sweeping your calendar, making sure that when their website's launching the week of, the people are available. You get the idea. Just thinking about it that way is really important. And also not being afraid to put resources on it, even if it's a, quote, loss, or we're going to go over budget, because we have to look at the trade-off at that point. It's like, what are we losing by going over budget a little bit? We're losing a huge amount of trust, which cuts into our retention. It cuts into our net promoter score. It cuts into our client satisfaction score. If you use those metrics, it's not good. And I've seen a lot of agency owners not do that. So that would be a huge piece of advice I would give people today.
Yeah, and that dovetails nicely into kind of the next thing that I want to unpack, which is, once we have an understanding of the pains and the context and the objectives that our client has, because we've done a better job of extracting that at the front end of the relationship, how we then actually change the way that we craft the client experience throughout that first project to set ourselves up for a higher level of trust going into the end of the engagement, to your point, where we can then use that to engage in another ongoing relationship or a follow-on project. And you've mentioned a couple of things already that I think are really insightful. The first one being this idea of staging and starting to position multiple people on the team as experts and building that trust and spreading it across different team members. You just talked about putting more of a focus on the end of the engagement so you can keep the trust level high. What other things have you found to be really effective in designing that client experience?
Yeah, those are two huge ones. And I think in general, to build on that a bit more, it's staging the particular check-ins, but also thinking about the engagement as one big thing, not just a series of meetings. And thinking about how might we build the trust arc better. And a lot of this gets into psychology and human psychology, which we can't go into depths on today, but just at a high level, I think we all understand that as humans, ask ourselves the question, if I'm buying my service and I'm investing the amount of money into this, where would I care? Where would I start to get annoyed? What would make me really lose trust in the agency? I think if we even just do that piece, we'll start to be able to channel what they are feeling. And I think that's big. So what that comes down to is realizing that, let's say if you have an engagement that's 3 months, and a lot of times you'll have one big review, especially if it's a waterfall type of project where, it's not in the sprint format like a lot of web projects are, where it's agile and we're doing things, throughout a period of time in these fast bursts. Either way, we prioritize this big review and then maybe a follow-up review, and then we get the files ready or we get the strategy approved. And then from there, there's this like dead zone where the client doesn't know what's going on. We're kind of finishing stuff. We're approving it. We're making the thing, right? And no matter what you're making, even if you're launching a strategy or like what you do, Marcel, there's a point where you got all the inputs and now you're kind of doing the stuff in the background and you're going to come back and start helping them execute, right? That part can be, we know a lot's going on in our minds and on our team, but often we're bad at communicating that to the actual clients themselves. And I think that's an area where we can build in, even if you feel it's manufactured check-ins, I think we should build them in to say, we're going to check in with you once a week. We're going to give you a Loom video update, which I do a lot of those as well. If a client isn't available, I'll send them a Loom or equivalent video walkthrough so that they're seeing our team. They're seeing my face. They're hearing that we're excited. We're able to inject emotion and actual information in both. It's huge. It's very important. So whether you do it in a meeting or not, I think that's big. So for example, if it's a 3-month engagement, if you only quote need 4 check-ins and you can only afford 4 check-ins in the budget, I would encourage our teams to find the money to pay for 3 more check-ins, right? Or break them down into smaller check-ins over time and understand that those check-ins are really going to make a huge difference. And that could even be a 15-minute FaceTime with someone. But I think that's really important to not create that dead zone between final approval and launch, because that's where a lot of the clients are like, what is going on? And I don't understand. I'm losing enthusiasm because I don't understand where we're going.
100%. It's so interesting. This is something that I am really bullish on in our own company, and I talk about all the time, which is like, it's almost impossible to over communicate when you are in client services.
Yes.
And it's even something as simple as, this is what we worked on, this is what we will be working on a regular basis, is so powerful, because we've all had a bad vendor. We've all had this experience where we brief somebody, we give them all this context, and then a few weeks go by and the wrong thing comes back. They were way off track. They just ghost us. Like it goes to shit. And so when you leave the narrative in the client's head, no matter how good of a job you're doing outside of their perspective, they get to create their own narrative in their mind. And most of the time, it's just not going to be a good one. And so the easiest way to control that narrative, to your point, is just to be clear and direct and proactively communicate what's going on, what you're doing, what progress you're making, what kind of things you're focused on. It really does go an extremely long way. And I heard somebody describe this recently, which is like, when a client asks you in the sales meeting what the deliverables are, you're going to usually describe to them what they get at the end of the engagement. And the reality is that for the weeks or months leading up to when they get those deliverables, really what you've sold them is communication.
Yes.
And that is the product until you actually have the deliverables ready. So the communication is essentially the entire engagement up until that last mile. So it's so important.
Yeah. Can I even add a finer point on it? I don't disagree. I think communication is big, but I think there's a layer on top of what I think we're selling. I think we're selling a dream. We're selling a vision. We're selling a future state that involves communication, but ultimately, if we can get clients to buy into that, and when I say a future state, the future state isn't the website. The future state is what the website achieves. And the future state is the transformation that each individual on their team has, and also their customers have. And I think if we can get them thinking about that, they're bought into it more at a vision level. This is not a new idea. Political campaigns do this. Fundraising, nonprofit campaigns do this. We've got to get people behind a shared goal. And then the communication starts to become easier that you're describing, because we know what we need to say to keep them excited about the future state and the dream, right? We have talking points that remember you wanted to be X. Remember we have to fight for our customer. Remember this, remember that. And we're reminding them of things that they committed to already. And it's great. It's good. And it gives you something to talk about, because as you were just speaking, I was thinking about what I've heard from some agency owners and team leaders as well. They either are afraid that if they create more check-ins with clients, they won't know what to say, that they're going to uproot trust because there's an ultimate lack of confidence in what they're showing up to talk about. And I think a lot of times we do that by design. We hide behind Slack, we hide behind emails because we don't really want to get in front of the client. Because as you said, we either don't want scope creep, we don't want to hear negative feedback, we don't really want to know that they're upset. I mean, we might think they are, but we don't want to deal with it. And I think sometimes that happens, and 3 weeks go by, you send some emails, and like you said, they've developed a whole narrative in their head that is not the one we want to live in. And we're probably they're not happy with us in their mind, in the narrative they've created.
And it's so interesting because whenever the client isn't happy or whenever something goes wrong, that is one of the biggest opportunities to build trust, actually, in my experience. Like, I've had so many instances like this as a customer of a brand, where what created brand loyalty for me was the way they reacted to something not going as planned. And they had great service and they over delivered. And I felt like, wow, if they handle things this well when they don't go right, like, they've really got a lot of integrity. And so the same can be true about these situations as well, which behooves like getting in front of those things early and creating the surface area for those things to come up early before they fester.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, I know we're talking about the functional aspects here too, but I will drop just a few things that come up in the coaching that I'm working with clients, because a lot of times when I say clients, I mean agency owners and people that are trying to show up in a way that's building trust and also encouraging their team to. Some of the things that we get into is how to actually pivot conversations. And that's a big one that I'll share a tip right now, because I think that's a big fear that people have, in that they're afraid. They're great with a crafted pitch when you're coming in with a keynote deck or a PowerPoint or Google slide deck, and it's more together. People, I find, are often horribly afraid of what happens after, and the conversation and the feedback after. And in fact, I've learned to really love that. And I've weaved that in actually into big deliverable presentations, by the way, asking in the beginning what they care about, because I think it's really important to hear from them. But I will say that one of the phrases I like to use is, it's very simple, but I train everybody. When someone comes to me and says, how do I pivot a conversation? This is what I tell them. I usually say a phrase something like, it sounds like X, this, that, or the other. It sounds like you are struggling with the final look of the website. It sounds like you're concerned this isn't going to work, whatever it is. And by doing that, you're building this trust with them, because there's this sense of shared understanding. You heard what they said and you're actually stating it back. These are not new ideas. I didn't invent these. I use them with great success in all of my delivery. In fact, it's become natural for me, and I try to train people to try to make it become natural as well. So that's one tip I would give everyone today. When you're in a conversation, rather than just talking at someone, try to restate everything back when they bring up feedback. It does not matter what it is, because then you do that. You understand, you make sure you heard them, and also it gives them room to share more information about it. So that's something I love to do in conversations, to pivot those points. And you can do that in those check-ins that you've manufactured later in the project. You can say, how are you feeling about this? Are you excited about where this is going? Are there any concerns you have, right? And then you're having these conversations, and then they feel heard. And I think that's the most important thing for trust building in that capacity at those stages in the project.
All right. So to recap what we've talked about so far, we've talked about really at the beginning of the client engagement, having those conversations that extract more of the context around their pains, what they care about, where they want to go, and then building in more touch points and more opportunities throughout the client experience to build and maintain that trust. Now I want to come to the big moment that I think most people would have been focused on going into this podcast episode, but I'm sure everything we've talked about is going to build to, which is when you get to the end of that initial project, how you structure or stage that conversation, that presentation, to give you the highest likelihood of having the client want to continue to work with you, or ask you to do more work, or perhaps take you up on an offer to continue to work on the problems that they have in their business.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I will That's a great question. And I will say that it starts earlier than the end in my mind. So when you look at a traditional engagement, let's imagine we've been using a website project. So that could be an example. A branding project could be as well. You're launching a new look for something, a new campaign, something with the beginning and end, which I think a lot of your listeners have. It starts, I think of it as a pinnacle. So you have this discovery phase, and then you have this rise. And the highest point of the project is usually, to date, that initial presentation. And that initial presentation isn't when it launches. That's usually when you're selling the big idea, right? You're selling the initial strategy, the initial system, your recommendation, your initial website, whatever it is. So that's big, and you have to nail that. But what I find is a lot of times it trails off after that, right? And it goes over here. And then by the time we're at the end, they have no momentum left. And we launch a website and no one's really excited about it. In turn, I think it should build. So I think the pinnacle should be not here. I think it should be here. And then you probably have like these points where you're going up. So every subsequent meeting is building on the enthusiasm of the initial vision that you casted to them. So in turn, it's not really a road to the end. It's a road to their future state, and their future state should include more work with you. That's the idea, right? So you're starting to seed it throughout. So for example, if you're in a website project, there are so many things that can extend from a website project. Content strategy, writing content, helping coach them with AI to write content if you're doing that approach. Video creation. I've seen this directly. I worked on a website project last year. It turned into video creation, a very robust, huge, long video engagement that came not at the end of the meeting. The videos were pitched in the actual website design to start, right? So it starts there, and then we seed it throughout. So when you get to the end, hopefully you've already signed them on for the new piece. They're either just trying to find the money, or they're trying to understand what the mechanics might look like. That's an ideal scenario. And so those final meetings are really more talking about next steps more than pitching something new at that moment. Yes. And I would say for a website project, you can see that later throughout. You can see things when you're looking at page designs or final, tangible pieces. You can talk about some upsell opportunities then too.
It's so interesting how, you outline the traditional emotional curve of a website project. And I think you're bang on in saying that like the presentation is when the excitement level is the highest. And then the reality of what it means to build and launch and implement and integrate something like that is what the rest of the engagement is working through. And unfortunately, most clients don't really understand how hard it is to execute on these kinds of things. And that I think is part of the reason that the momentum starts to decrease over time. And so this idea of essentially like zooming back out to the vision, enhancing that vision, planting seeds throughout of like what this is tying into, what more could look like, it is really interesting. Do you have any other kind of very tactical tips on how to take a check-in that might occur partway through an engagement and try to increase the level of momentum that creates, as opposed to having it be so focused on these tactical execution problems that it actually detracts from that?
Yeah, exactly. So I would say a couple things. I never think of a check-in as tactical only. I always build vision into everything. So it's staged in kind of two parts. It's the future state reminder, some sort of vision casting for that micro thing we're reviewing, and then tactical product requirements, the tangible things at the back, or maybe they're weaved throughout. But I never, ever, ever waste an opportunity to remind them of the emotional aspect of the work. Now, that doesn't have to be 20 minutes of a 30-minute presentation. It could be 5 minutes or 3 minutes of a 30-minute meeting. But the important thing is making sure that they understand that you're still excited about it. Using emotive words yourself. We're really excited about these specific things we made on this specific page. So we're not even just we're not talking about the big vision of the big presentation. We're talking about today. We're excited about this particular thing. We're excited about how this is going to convert more people because of the way that it works, or the way that this technology is going to work. You get the idea. Whatever it is, just really package it in a way that sells vision. It creates an emotive reaction, and also it answers their tactical questions too. I think if you could cover those three things in every check-in, you're going to notice that the client feels more excited throughout the project, because even if you have what you would call a non-emotive client, we always have emotion. We make decisions based on emotion, and those pains are rooted in emotion, not as much logic, right? And so I think if we can continue to tap into those in those check-ins, it starts to change how you use a boring 30-minute check-in to now make it something really impactful. And it happens at every week for a 3-month engagement, for example. You'll see a huge change in the trust building relationship very quickly in my experience. Absolutely.
All right. So this is a topic that, we could talk for hours on. There's infinite amounts of nuance, infinite amount of tactics, but unfortunately we don't have the time for all of that on the podcast, but I'm sure you have other great resources that people who want to dig deeper can go and access. So where should we send them in the show notes so they can learn more about you and the ideas that you're publishing?
Yeah, definitely. Well, my website's a great place to start. It's Joey Tackett, Tackett, as you can see behind me, .com. That has all of the stuff I spoke about. So that has some free trainings. It also has some of the paid engagements that I do as well. So you can find all those there, including some of the stuff I just talked about today. The guides and things like that are part of those trainings. So that would be a great place to start if you're interested in understanding some of the methodologies I described. And also YouTube. I launched a YouTube channel a couple months ago. I'm excited about that. And I'm putting obviously a lot of free content on there as well. And I'm putting up a video every week. So that is obviously on YouTube, and it's at Hey Joey Tackett on YouTube. So those would be two great places to start. And I don't know if I'm weird, Marcel. I love LinkedIn DMs. So find me on LinkedIn, connect with me, DM me. I love human engagement on LinkedIn. So anyone that's listening that wants to chat, ask a question, I'm available. I will not get annoyed if you write me. Just don't try to sell me anything out the gate. Just have a real conversation.
I think you and I are both weird because I'm the same way. I just love chopping it up in the old LinkedIn DMs.
Yeah.
So with that, we're going to make sure to include a link to Joey's website, Joey's socials, including his LinkedIn in the show notes, as well as the YouTube channel. And we'll grab a copy of that guide as well. We'll put a link to the training that includes the client POV guide that you mentioned earlier. And with that, if you're looking for those resources, just scroll down. They'll be in the show notes. And Joey, can't thank you enough for making the time to be on the show today, man. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in to today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. And if you've ever found yourself thinking, man, I get so much value from this podcast, I wish there was something I could do to return the favor. Well, today's your lucky day because you can leave us a review wherever you're listening to this, and it is incredibly helpful. Of course, if you haven't grabbed a free copy of the Agency Profit Toolkit, go and get that. It's got tons of free resources to help you improve your profitability. If you're looking to get in the fast lane and get help from experts to improve your profitability and measure your most important metrics, then apply for a consultation at Parakeeto.com. We'd love to chat with you and figure out how we can help. With all of that, thank you so much for being a listener, and we will see you on the next episode.